This is Criteria. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. I'm James Majewski here with my co-host Thomas V. Miras. How's it going, Thomas?
Hey, James.
And we are here today, this is very exciting, talking about the last film in our series on Terrence Malick. It's the last for now because he is working on a forthcoming film about Jesus Christ. But this one is the last of his released films that we have available to discuss. It's also interesting because almost 6 years ago exactly, we saw this film when it was released at an early screening here in New York City, and we discussed it on another podcast, Thomas's very own The Catholic Culture podcast. This was before the existence of Criteria, and in a lot of ways, that episode served as sort of a proof of concept for our film discussions here on Criteria. Right. But this episode will be fresh because now we're coming at it having watched everything else in Malick's filmography. We'll be able to sort of view it within that context. And then, of course, we have returning with us our guest co-host, Nathan Douglas. Welcome back to the show, Nathan.
Hey, guys. Great to be back. Thank you for having me again.
Now, Nathan, I remember that you actually listened to that original episode of A Hidden Life. It was like 6 years ago, yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I was a faithful listener of the Catholic Culture podcast. And when a movie topic came up, and not just a movie topic, but Terrence Malick, my favorite living director, of course, my interest was very high, and I was blown away by the discussion you guys had. I was very happy to hear it, and I thought it's great to hear two guys of same generation who are dealing with Malick at this level of depth, and that was really kind of what put Criteria on the map for me, even though it didn't exist at that point. When I heard that Criteria was in the works, then I knew that, okay, I gotta, keep track of this, and the rest is history.
And keep track you have. Keep track you have.
many tracks since then, yes.
I do think that episode holds up. And so we'll definitely link to it in the show notes. And another reason why people may want to go and listen to that episode is because we get into a little more detail about the life of Blessed Franz Jägerstätter. Of course, I haven't mentioned this film, A Hidden Life, what it's about. It's about Blessed Franz Jägerstätter, who was a Austrian farmer during World War II, drafted by the Nazis, but then who refused to swear an oath to Hitler and ultimately to fight in a combat role in the Nazi army. And so he was executed. He was not really well known around the world or within the church until he was beatified by Pope Benedict XVI. So still, very much a recent name. I think this film went a long way toward popularizing him and making him and his wife, Franziska, more well known. But also, if you listen to that previous episode that we did, I had just recently finished reading his collection of letters, which are amazing. So we get into a little more detail about that. I read some excerpts from the letters, and so definitely worth listening to that episode as well. But,
yeah, that was a good one. And also, there's a great episode of the New Polity podcast with a friend of mine, Ruben Slife, just focused on not on the movie, on the life of Blessed Franz. It goes into it doesn't just repeat all the same things we said in our episode. It's even more detail about his life, and I found it very enjoyable and interesting. So I'll link to that one as well for people who want to just really go down the rabbit hole. But yeah, this is also kind of an interesting one in Malick's filmography. In the last several films of his we've discussed, he's known for taking this very non-linear style, working without a script, tons of improvisation. And leading up to this movie, he commented that he had moved back. I think he used the word repented of that approach in the process of making A Hidden Life, and moved back somewhat from that scriptless approach. Of course, he's this is a historical topic, so it sort of makes sense in a way to do that, right? But he had mentioned that there was a lot of difficulties in production in making films without scripts, stresses on the production team, just a lack of predictability and all the rest of it. So, but it's not a complete regression from that, because it sort of combines aspects of that aesthetic that he had developed in the past several years, whatever the past decade and a half or however long it was. With the kind of linear narrative that he hadn't really done since The New World, his film about Pocahontas, another historical topic. So it's an interesting one to come back to now that we have seen. I hadn't seen all of these in between films. I'd only seen The Tree of Life of his later period, when I saw Hidden Life. So now I've seen all the rest of them as well.
Well, and another thing that's interesting to note is that, well, I'm just sort of thinking of this now as a similarity to The New World, which is, well, aside from its being based on a real life historical circumstance and set of characters, also has a kind of textual inheritance. So in the case of Blessed Franz, we have his letters and his wife's letters, and the film does make very liberal use of those letters in the voiceover and in some of the scenarios that it depicts. Right. So I just wonder, how much you can not adopt a script approach when your subject is so well documented. He almost gives you the script in his letters.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Of course, Malick is a filmmaker, as we now know, who's very want to give these sort of philosophical or spiritual musings and reflections through voiceover. And Franz, in his letters, many of which were written from prison to his wife when he was, really just preparing for death, are kind of like a gold mine for precisely that kind of material.
That's right, yeah.
So it's very Malickian, so to speak, already. It's like the script wrote itself.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how, it's when the film came out, when it premiered at Cannes in 2019, there was this kind of chorus of critical feedback calling it a return to form, which, is kind of understandable for all these reasons that we're stating, especially with a much more kind of linear narrative being the center of the film. But it is interesting in some ways that cry that he's back. The people who didn't like what he was doing with all the experimental improvisational work, seem to think that, okay, we have the real Malick back. But that's not really the case when you kind of look at just the way the film works moment to moment. It is very much a continuation, in my view, of that experimental process in terms of how they shoot, looking for those moments. That's kind of the core essence of, I think we could say, of a Malick film, is that search for the profound moment. And even though it's within a more tightly defined structure narratively, it's definitely there. Like it's a continuation of what we have seen.
Do you think it's more so, that those moments, so to speak, in that editing stylism, do you think it's more so than in The New World?
That's a good question. I would put it at least on par with it. Just
that's
based
what I would
on
think.
What's
yeah.
on screen.
Oh,
I don't feel like it's more or less.
I definitely think it's more.
Yeah.
I think that this film's DNA has a lot more in common with the existential trilogy or the Weightless Trilogy, whatever it's called, than it does with A New World. I think there's a lot more overlap with a film like Song to Song even than there is with...
Aesthetically speaking?
Yeah, cinematically, you know, so it's not just in the way that it appears, but in its sort of sensibility, in its focus, in its sensitivity, its sort of like delicate touch, its pacing, its use of montage. Not that these things aren't present in A New World, but I just feel that in A Tree of Life and in the Weightless Trilogy, that's all dialed up to 10 or 11, and then maybe this brings it back down to 10 or 9, that it still feels like very full-throated Malick, but now a little more applied. If that makes sense.
Yeah, maybe the biggest difference that we see throughout the film is that there are concrete there are discrete scenes. There are sections that feel like scenes that kind of have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Whereas, especially in something like Song to Song, it feels much more like just moment to moment.
Yes.
Stitched together. All these ephemeral moments stitched together. If nothing else, Hidden Life goes back to this desire to have a bit of a more conventional dramatic structure, at least within scenes. But the biggest example that comes to mind for me is really the ending, in the lead up to his execution, where you're kind of left in this almost real time experience of waiting to go to the guillotine, and so there's kind of a natural building tension. Again, it's a bit more, I think, conventional in that sense than just moment to moment, and that's throughout the film. There are other scenes like that, dialogue scenes particularly, where there's a clear kind of goal of the scene of Franz wants to litigate his problem with this person, with his priest or with his bishop, or the painter that he's talking to. That there's kind of a clear dramatic goal to these scenes. So I think that's maybe the main development, but it's still within this reflexive, reactive structure of like looking for the moment. And really the majority of the film, I think this is maybe what stood out to me the most on this viewing. The majority of the film, is still moment to moment to moment, for 3 hours, which, for the viewer who hasn't seen the film, don't let that, sound intimidating. It's kind of amazing to me how that time just goes, and I think we'll probably get into it later as far as the length and what's going on there. But this is very much a continuation and evolution of what formerly has already been happening.
Right. And of course, when he's doing those kinds of dialogue scenes, it's still very distinctively Malick in a way that goes back even before his more experimental period of the way the silences, the way people look at each other, the way people sort of like wander around each other, and all of those things that go back even before Tree of Life, at least back to the New World, if not Thin Red Line maybe. So that stuff is still very distinctive.
Totally. I mean, even Days of Heaven comes to mind, but also Days to Heaven and Badlands come to mind in this infatuation with landscape and with nature.
Of course.
I mean, that's obviously present in all of his films to one degree or another, but I think that probably not since Days of Heaven have you seen the sort of like lavish pastoral scenes that you see in this film. It's like it really does harken back to Days of Heaven in a lot of respects, with this young romance essentially happening out in the fields, among beautiful vistas and sunsets and open sky. So,
and also, if I could say, I mean, the subject matter of this film is different from the Weightless Trilogy, and so the stylistic change sort of makes sense in a way as well.
That's
not
a good
just
point.
The fact that it's a historical thing, but there is memory, there are flashbacks, so it's much less focused on memory. It's much less about people living dissolute lives, and all of these things. So I think the stylistic shift kind of makes sense for the subject matter as well.
Maybe this is the beginning of his weighty trilogy.
Okay,
it really does feel very different, because here is a man of real substance, and so this is another comparison that you might draw in other father figures that we've seen, most notably in Tree of Life. There we get also a very long meditation on family, on marriage, on fatherhood. But of course, in Tree of Life, the father character is very compromised. And here, this most recent viewing for me, that was what stood out the most, was just how much this is a portrait of how a man loves. Like, we get to see, even before he's doing anything heroic with respect to refusing Nazi service or whatever, we just see him loving his wife, loving his children, working, being a part of his community, serving the church. It's not in this sort of like idealized or romanticized way. It is romantic and it is ideal, but it's very real as well. And so that's kind of what I mean by this is a man with weight, with substance, and Malick just does, this is totally his wheelhouse. He does such a good job of painting this picture for us. The first 20 to 30 minutes of the film, I think, are just absolutely breathtaking, not just in terms of their visual beauty, but in terms of like how well Malick is able to sort of pull these strands together of the life in St. Radegund, this small mountain village where Blessed Franz and his family live, the dynamics of their family and of their marriage, what's happening within Europe and what's sort of coming to Austria, and also the dynamics of this community and how they're being affected as well. It's all done in just sort of this very exhilarating way, and using all of these tools that Malick has been developing with montage and with camera work and with utilizing other kinds of footage, historical footage.
Yes.
It's all done very deftly, so that in the moment you're not even really thinking about it, you're just accepting it. But I think that a careful study of that opening 20 minutes would yield like, wow, this guy is actually doing quite a lot to bring us into this story and very effectively and economically convey a lot of things that are going to pay dividends throughout the film.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you're saying that, it's kind of coming with what's standing out to me in hindsight about that first act. You could say is how much of it is just a portrait of marriage, like of a good marriage, and actually how much that actually flows, I think, out of the Weightless Trilogy, which all three of those films, To the Wonder, Night of Cups, and Song to Song, are about romantic love in a very in frequently and usually always broken ways. And in some ways, the first act of A Hidden Life is this kind of perfection, you could say, of this is perfected portrait. It's I do think it is idealized. I do think it is romanticized, and I'd be curious to hear, James, as the married man in this conversation, I'd love to hear your reflections on this. But to me, there is definitely some idealization going on of the marriage state. But it to me, I almost wonder if it's Malick, like continuing from these portraits of brokenness, and many of which are drawn from his own autobiography, filtered through his artistic sensibility. It's interesting how the example of Blessed Franz and Franziska, kind of presents this opportunity to continue that and to show this is what a truly good marriage looks like or could look like. So that and not just in a way that's like setting up. I think it's not operating in a purely functional way. To me, it feels like that. To me, actually, I think that is actually the substance of the film that Malick is most interested in some ways, because that's the lens through which we see the decision. Everything about the conflict is really through this lens of how is this going to affect this perfect romantic love that we see through, and especially in the beginning.
Yeah, well, I think the way the portrayal of the marriage and the social fabric and the beautiful setting works in part is, in this sort of plot way. In a lot of Malick's films, it's like that the nature is sort of symbolic or transcendent, and that's all there, of course. But the sort of point to me is like, well, this is now what he's going to sacrifice. He has this beautiful marriage. He has this beautiful family. There's so many good things about the social fabric of this village and this agricultural life and the setting where they live. And now he's going to have that. He's going to choose to have that taken away from him. And so the drama, what's being sought, what's being lost, is a little bit different in this film than in some of the other ones, because it's really about a character who makes a choice rather than a character who is sort of wandering around and seeking something.
Yeah.
I also think what really stood out to me on this, I think my third viewing of this film, was the portrayal of the social fabric and the in particular the sense of foreboding and sort of the sense of social pressure and the sense of a general foreboding of what's happening to this country as the film progresses is done really well. A lot of those moments serve to kind of set up this beautiful situation and then to sort of see those elements of foreboding creeping into it. And I think that, like, insofar as, you know, you look at this film, it's a film about a man making a decision of conscience, right? You can compare it. It's a very different film from something like A Man for All Seasons in terms of its cinematic approach and all that, but you can compare it to that in certain ways, or other films you could name about a similar kind of saint, a saint who has this knocking on his door and he has to decide how he's going to respond, you know? And I think that kind of, rather than kind of going into having a really dialogue heavy sort of like philosophical debate, I think what stuck out to me in terms of what the film spent its time on is that sense of the kind of the foreboding and what it would be like to live through that experience of having your world change subtly and then not subtly in that way. Yeah,
I will say that on those elements in the film, they did hit differently for me this time because, of course, when we saw the film, this was late 2019. This was before the COVID-19 pandemic, before all of the sort of cultural changes and, disruptions that happened in the wake of that. 6 years, it's not a short amount of time, and it's a lot has happened in our lifetimes just in those 6 years. And so those elements were hitting me differently for sure. But before going much further into that, I did want to just say, in connection to what you had said, Thomas, about this family, part of what's set up here is illustrating what he sacrifices. I think another big thing that's being indicated is how his family life, his marriage, his relationship with his wife is what makes his sacrifice possible. And so that we get a lot of allusions to how he's a changed man. People in the community or his mother say that before he married you, he was different. What changed him? You changed him, and as a married man myself, I could certainly relate to this, that having a family, it does sort of change things on a molecular level, maybe not necessarily, but I think with God's grace, if you're open to the sacrament, it has to happen. With the Weightless Trilogy, these are men, women too, who are like seeking themselves, But here we have a picture of someone who is not seeking himself. He's giving himself from the very beginning. And this is why maybe it's just a semantic thing. Maybe it's just a difference in terms. Why I wouldn't describe it as idealized or romanticized. For me, those terms basically mean unreal. So yes, it is ideal. Yes, it is romantic, but it's also very real. Like this is what a good marriage is. And so, maybe I'm misapplying the term, because of course, Malick is a very romantic filmmaker. And so he does have a way of imbuing everything with this beautiful aura, but we see that their life is not easy. It's a life of manual labor. It's a life, yes, with this social foreboding and foment, societal pressures, even from within their tight-knit community, and also times of disagreement between the two of them. It's not like we get full-blown arguments between them, but there is like a negotiation that has to take place between the two of them. It's not like they're completely of one heart and mind with no ambiguities throughout the whole film. Like that thread is a major dramatic one that kind of doesn't fully get resolved until the very end. So I look at it as very realistic in that sense. And it definitely made me, watching it the second time, just want to be a better husband and father. Yeah. This was the effect that reading Blessed Franz's letters had on me at the beginning of my marriage. I've been married now for a little over 6 years. I think that I do want to just sort of underline that I don't think that there's anything fantastic about the depiction here.
Yeah, I think my original takeaway, just on your point about how it affected you back then, my takeaway at the time was like, I would rather have this kind of marriage, which is in a sense a failure by worldly standards because they are separated and he's not be able to be there as a father to his children. I would rather have that kind of marriage than kind of like a mediocre marriage where everything kind of works out in a worldly material sense.
Yeah.
Now, as far as it's being unrealistic, I wouldn't say it's unrealistic. I would say that there's certain things it just doesn't show us, right? So it doesn't really show us how he got to be the kind of man that he is. And maybe there's a connection there to the way that it portrays his religious life or something that we could get into. But I don't think it's so concerned with like the difficulties that they had to, work on earlier in their marriage to sort of get to their marriage being as strong as it was.
Yeah.
I think it's really concerned with this is what he had. Now this is the challenge that comes and threatens it, and now he has to choose how to handle that. Am I going to save this thing? Am I going to try to save this marriage, or am I going to let it go by? He literally is. He's not sacrificing his love for his wife, but he is literally sacrificing his marriage because he's going to die, and that's going to be the end of the marriage.
Right. And I think it's just beautiful that this same filmmaker who was able to show us like such scenes of debauchery and like listlessness and crisis can also, with a similarly expert hand, show us real love and selflessness and peace. It's kind of amazing when you think about it.
Yeah, it's carried through, at least the sense I get watching the film is that this is the sense, certainly this is an older man's film. This is a film of someone who has, suffered and appreciates, basically is able to appreciate like the little things, the meaning of the moment to moment, in a way that perhaps he couldn't have earlier. At least that's the sense. There's a real sense of wisdom, I would say, and maybe I'm reading elements of his biography, back into that, inadvertently, but I think it's also the film's good, that this is a portrait of the good, that is hard won, I think.
I think it's totally fair to read elements of his biography into this because I think in many ways he puts himself into his films. We, of course, saw that in the Weightless Trilogy, certain autobiographical notes. But then here we get this amazing sequence that is often pointed to with the painter in the chapel. So maybe we can just talk a little bit about that, because even though it might be a little hackneyed, I think that scene is the one that I've seen most referenced since the release of this film. It seems to be the one that everybody wants to talk about.
There's a reason for that. It's the only like literary scene in the entire film.
Yeah, and it's incredible. I mean, it's like it gives you so much to chew on, Yeah. So I don't know, Thomas, do you want to introduce that section?
Well, he apparently is friends with this church painter, and he's there hanging out, maybe assisting him in some way. And the painter is this older man who is reflecting on the fact that a certain dissatisfaction with his work, that he paints this suffering that he hasn't lived, the suffering of Christ. And he feels that, these paintings on the ceiling of this church, he says they people look up at them and they dream, but they create admirers rather than followers and imitators of Christ. And he says that, there's a certain courage that he currently lacks. He says, maybe someday I might have courage to paint the true Christ, a more challenging Christ. And that obviously, you can say it connects to Malick's aspirations. His next film is going to be about Christ, right? He probably already has this in mind. It's also about the social context in which they're in, because we're seeing a situation where this Christian community is in many respects failing to stand up to evil. And in particular, we get a portrayal of even the hierarchical church failing to do so. And so I think there's that as well. It's like, okay, so what does all this actually mean? What does all this kind of this pageantry mean if it doesn't mean following Christ rather than just sort of admiring him from a distance?
Yeah. And I mean, I think that there isn't just a nod to the limitations of art, of craft, of knowledge, that you can be as sort of poetic as you want to be, as intelligent as you want to be, you can be as skilled of an artist as you want to be. But if on some level, if you're not converting yourself, you know, the way I read this scene is not that this painter is necessarily, you know, wishing for some kind of extravagant martyrdom to come his way, but is actually just sort of talking about a personal lack of courage, which we see exhibited in Franz. You know, this courage Franz has even before he's brought to the guillotine, right? So it's about, to me, about the spiritual wisdom that comes from real conversion and real sort of following Jesus, you know, in the day-to-day. And that this, I take this moment, this sequence, as a kind of nod to the kind of moral certainty or knowledge that one gets from that. This sort of this simple knowing that comes from that's revealed to little children and not to, you know, amazing artists or philosophers or world leaders or what have you, you know? And so, like, as much as it resonates perhaps with the figure of Malick himself and, you know, the project of making a film about Christ, it's also resonating on a sort of spiritual and human level in the person of Blessed Franz, because Franz is the one who is sort of able to speak for Christ in a way. You know, he's getting on the inside by virtue of his conversion, you know, and his conforming himself to Jesus. And so I think that this is a challenge for artists, for anyone, for theologians, you know, for whomever is going to sort of presume to depict Jesus or speak for Jesus or interpret Jesus, that there's this kind of, I mean, I think about this too, just for myself, that I read these works on Catholic Culture audiobooks, or that I work for a website like CatholicCulture.org, where we're talking about the church and we're reporting on the news. It's like, well, okay, that's all very well and good, but this has to be proceeding from the kind of intimate, like, familiarity that comes from a life of real prayer and real trying to follow Jesus.
Right. And there's another thing that which people bring up about Malick in relation to this movie, which is this letter that he wrote to Martin Scorsese after seeing the film Silence, which had come out in 2016, where Scorsese published an excerpt of this, and he asks, Malick asks Scorsese, what is Christ's demand of us, or something like that. And so this aspect of it only occurs to me just now, but you know, Silence is a film about a priest who apostatizes under the threat of martyrdom, and or not just under the threat of martyrdom, actually under the threat of other people suffering if he stays faithful to Christ.
Yeah.
Right. And that is the preeminent temptation that, in a very repetitive way, Blessed Franz in this film hears from everybody. They'd say, first of all, the big thing they say is, what's the point? This isn't going to, you know, change the world, as though he had said that he wanted to change the world. Like, you know, but you know, that speaks to the title, A Hidden Life, right? But then the other thing they say is, you actually have an obligation to your family to protect them. This affects other people. This affects your village, et cetera, et cetera. And so that only just occurred to me that that's sort of like almost a direct response to the choice made by the priest in Silence to apostatize rather than see, you know, the Japanese converts tortured and killed. So yeah, I don't know that Malick was sort of like deliberately doing that as like a repost to Scorsese or anything, but like it is interesting to consider.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, Thomas, because I think the film definitely, it stood out to me on this viewing how much A Hidden Life feels like a response to Silence, like in exactly those ways, and hitting the same, even in ways that I just didn't quite pick up on first viewing. The challenge to me seems to be very, very pointed in sort of a subtle way.
Right.
One thing, just with the painter scene, I wanted to kind of bring up is, it is interesting to me how that scene, you know, I said earlier, it's the only literary scene in the film. And I just want to explain what I mean by that, in that it's it's the scene everyone writes about because it's the most content rich in a way, you know, in that it's dealing with the deeper philosophical and theological questions that are kind of behind the whole film. And it's laying it out in a very kind of clear way. And there's nothing wrong with that. I want to be very clear. I love the scene. I would, you know, be very sad if it wasn't in the film. But I kind of want to use that as just like I would love to get your guys' thoughts on, like, you know, maybe this question of like the didactic, not that the scene is didactic, but the mode. It's interesting to me that I think the mode in which a lot of Christians receive the film, especially I think a lot of Catholic critics, is like, if that scene wasn't in the film, then people would be kind of at a loss, I think, to like draw something out of it. That's my impression from reading a lot of the criticism, is like, oh, there's a sense of relief almost of like, oh, like, you know, there's this kind of, you know, weighty thematic discussion, and at least we can do something with that.
It gives them something to grab onto, and it is easier to talk about that in a way than to talk about this sort of the sum total of all these other different moments that occur throughout the film. I mean, the film would be, I think, pretty intelligible as a film about martyrdom without that scene. But if you want to have something to write about and kind of analyze, and the artist sort of gives you a hermeneutic through which to do so, then it's kind of inevitable that people will grab onto that, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it helps that it's basically by way of analogy. You know, he's talking about painting Christ and depicting Christ artistically, but the concerns of the film are not to do with that. You know, this is not a movie about a Catholic artist, but it's a way of sort of analogously approaching this problem of how is Christ communicated. And, you know, this awesome line, we create admirers, not followers. You kind of see the reverse of that in the witness that Blessed Franz is able to offer. Of course, we don't see anybody sort of like having these amazing conversions, but we see the way that Franz's witness touches people, especially towards the end of the film. The you know, Nazi guards, or we get this appearance from Bruno Ganz, is that his name?
Yeah.
Who's sort of the Nazi military tribunal judge. We get this very quiet moment with him sitting in the seat that had just been vacated by Franz after their meeting, basically. And you get the impression that here there's another kind of hidden life, you know, in the hearts of these people that are encountering Blessed Franz, and that here is a witness, here is a communication of Jesus that is capable of forming a follower and not just an admirer. You know, we don't get people just admiring Franz's sacrifice, but being challenged by it.
Right.
You know, I don't think, I mean, maybe this is too much of a digression, but like, I don't think that it is a summation of the themes of the film or even of the concerns of Franz. You know, I think it's one side of them. I think what makes it potent for me is how it's working on several different levels. And one of them is in this sort of very self-aware way of acknowledging the problem, I think, of depicting sanctity. You know, that it's, yes, he's talking about Jesus, but he's talking about holiness. He's talking about how to communicate something that's more than just creating sympathy, creating admirers, you know. And I think that's very relevant because as a filmmaker, I'm not that I'm a filmmaker, but if I were a filmmaker, I would want people to leave my film wanting to convert, not just thinking, oh, that's very beautiful or how touching, you know? And so like I see it as, yes, like a very core part of the film, but as not kind of recapitulating the whole of what the drama or the problem is. It's a part of the problem. But I see it as supplementing a lot of the other considerations that aren't brought out necessarily explicitly. I mean, the whole marriage side of this, I see as much more central of a theme much more dominant of a theme throughout than this problem of like communicating the gospel. Although obviously that is like at the heart of everything. But it's like we don't get a long reflection on marriage, you know? We just get a lot of things shown to us. Same with like the social dynamics that we were alluding to, you know, like that's a strain that's present throughout the film. But there's not really a handy guide for understanding what Malick's politics might be, you know, or what he thinks about, you know, particular issues or whatever. So, you know, I think that like, I don't know, I see this moment, you know, as being like just like another nice thing thrown into the pot, you know, and not so much as a kind of brute force injection of like, and here's what I'm talking about, or here's what the concerns are. To the extent that people latch on to that, well, yeah, okay, that's understandable. This gives you the most like concrete stuff to talk about because it's written out there, plain as can day. But if it's gonna make you look at the film simply through the hermeneutic of that scene, I do think that that's ultimately reductive, you know, and it's a helpful side, but that there's a lot more going on in the film beside.
The other thing he gives us is the title and the quote from George Eliot at the end in terms of kind of a literary.
Do you remember the quote from George Eliot?
No, but it's something like, you know, the fact that the gradual improvement of the world and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is due to
so many who live a hidden life.
A hidden life, yeah.
Hidden life of people that the world has never heard of.
And rest in
paraphrase.
And rest in unvisited tombs.
Right. So, you know, and that again connects to that taunt that he's given throughout is what you're doing makes no difference. Nobody will ever hear about this. You know, not only that, but your children are not going to grow up knowing their father implicitly. You know, and so his life is hidden in that sense as well. Even his life in his family is hidden.
Yeah. I mean, this was something we touched on a little bit in the first episode that we covered, with which we discussed this film. The name is like super provocative. Yeah. And it's very rich because you can understand it on all these different levels. Yes, there's like the fact that this was a relatively unknown man until he was beatified. And so in some sense, you know, his act of defiance, you know, didn't get any play. It didn't change any hearts as far as we can tell, you know. But for every one Blessed Franz, there are countless others who are living like these hidden lives and have these hidden sacrifices, right? I think there's a sense in which we can think just sort of constitutionally, all of our lives are a hidden life on some level, that like at the end of the day, even great men of history are forgotten in the sands of time, you know, and they'll all just sort of be swallowed up in the cosmos, you know, and hidden in the whatever. So, but then what I was thinking about on this viewing was the interior life, and how that this is a life that is hidden from others and totally hidden from, like, these are hidden motives. This is where our impure motives live, but also where conversion takes place. That the sort of dynamics of the heart are a mystery. And I mentioned that moment with Bruno Ganz. You know, I think that there are several moments throughout the film where we get this acknowledgement of other people's hidden lives, how things are not as they seem on the surface, you know? And then, of course, there's the famous quote of our life being hidden in Christ, you know, and that Francisca, there's a mention that she makes in the film about how somehow all of these things will sort of work to the good, that everything will kind of
someday
resolve.
We'll know what all this was for. Exactly.
But I think that it's worth thinking about this element of interiority precisely because Malick does not go out of his way to explain to us Blessed Franz's reasonings. You know, to such an extent that someone who's not initiated, someone who's not Catholic or Christian, doesn't know Blessed Franz's story, might actually be a little confused on the surface as to like why he's doing any of this.
As I seem to recall, a number of critics were sort of like, I still don't understand what made this guy tick, what made him do what he did. And, you read some quotes from his letters and reflections, and listening back to that episode, I remember one in particular where he's highly eloquent in explaining his reasons, saying, does the moral law change simply because a man has a wife and children,
right.
That kind of thing. And so it's interesting that the film doesn't really, he mostly is the sort of the suffering servant, not really speaking and speaking pretty softly, and kind of like saying things like, well, if God gives us free will, then we're responsible for what we do with it, and things like that. But it's not exactly an apologetic, for his actions.
I do feel like this is one of the shortcomings of the film, that I do wish that it, while it doesn't depict anything, that would be counter to Blessed Franz's motivations or the real life person, at least not in a way that like some other saint films of late, have done. It doesn't falsify its subject. I also feel that it doesn't fully give, the full breadth of who this man was and of what was driving him, of who was driving him. The consolation that he received from the church, from various devotions, from the sacraments, and like you said, Thomas, his eloquence in justifying himself. I mean, we have all of his letters, and he does go in quite convincing detail. This was a man who could justify what he was doing, the stance that he was taking. But on the other hand, I don't want to dock the film too much for that, because of what we've been talking about with this problem of creating admirers or creating followers. To me, there's something to be said for this relative silence, not just in the allusion to the suffering servant or what have you, but in the recognition that it's not the apologetics that convince. It's not the rationale that ultimately touches the heart, but it's love, and it's the witness, it's the moral act itself that's capable of changing. So changing others, that is. So that's kind of what I'm wondering if it's not. I'm wondering if Malick isn't asking us to kind of stay with that sense of, confusion, of disorientation, of kind of being scandalized by this action, and just sort of seeing it from without, as so many people did. Do you know what I mean?
I think there's truth to what you're saying. I also think, a shortcoming of this, which you mentioned in our original podcast, is that maybe the viewer is allowed to leave with the impression that this is just something sort of very personal to Blessed Franz.
Yes, right.
Like the conscience of St. Thomas More as depicted in A Man for All Seasons, such as he's not saying, no, like this is what the church says, or this is what reason tells us, or anything like that. It's just kind of like, this is, I believe, what matters is that I believe it, so, and likewise, one of his responses is, I don't judge anyone else, now that's true. And St. Thomas More actually did say that. He said, I don't judge other people's consciences and how they're responding to that situation. But when that's all, relatively we hear of in Blessed Franz responses to the people, who are accusing him and trying to get him to change his decision, then it doesn't really, I guess the focus of that scene with Bruno Ganz is on the challenge to the judge's conscience, and therefore, But
I do wish that some of these motivations and elements, and personal,
the objective
convictions
aspect of it,
we're not left so hidden. You know what I mean? But it is nice, like in this final scene right before his execution, we don't even hear the prayer really clearly. Nor do we see him mouthing it. We get it as a very quiet, sort of indistinct voiceover, as we see a shot of his face. And again, I think in this nod to the vitality of what's going on interiorly in that moment right before his death, that this is a man who's praying to God. There's this whole inner drama that's taking place, even in this moment of his seeming defeat.
Right.
Yeah, I want to push back a little bit on this, in that I think it's incredibly fruitful. It's a very fruitful decision cinematically, to at least to leave some of the motivations obscured, like in the other, or rather to say like the reasoning, like we're not seeing his reasoning.
Yeah.
Because it does invite the viewer to really place yourself in that position of what would I do? And even as you're talking, it brought to mind something that's very curious, like camera wise in this film, is how often Malick will use a point of view shot to put us in the place of Blessed Franz, especially when he's being beaten, in the prison. Right. It happens a few times.
There's also a scene where he's speaking with his wife. That's quite prolonged shot of his wife speaking to him from his perspective.
Yeah, it's to me that's certainly on a formal level. That's like something we haven't quite seen Malick do to this extent, and I think it does underline this. There's a kind of distance I think he's trying to create between the historical Franz, as we would read like in a book or whatever, and the first person experience of what would I do. And this just kind of builds on, again, the context of the Scorsese letter, I think is actually more, significant than maybe it seems at first glance. That question of what does Christ ask of us? What does he demand of us? The viewer is placed in a position to really mull that over. And part of that also is the length of the film,
Right.
I know Thomas, when we were messaging earlier this week, and Thomas, you mentioned how you thought the film is too long, and maybe we can discuss that in a second. But one thing that comes to mind for me with that is like, one benefit of the length is that it really just gives you can't really escape. You have to enter into this time element of what would I do. You're given a lot of time to contemplate that and to really discover in yourself, or to interrogate yourself, what would I do, in a way that, just to bring this back to A Man for All Seasons, in a way for that A Man for All Seasons doesn't do, because part of the greatness of A Man for All Seasons, like in terms of its writing, is it presents this brilliant person, and yes, we can consider ourselves in relation to, Thomas More in that depiction. But you're kind of left going, wow, he was great. Like that's him.
It's fully formed and kind of like handed to you.
Yeah. And here I think there's a lot of room being left that's really bringing you in to go, okay, I think it's more participatory in a hidden life.
That's a good point. Yeah. I mean, I think that, obviously we know that Malick can make a good film, but he can also do other things with a film. What I mean by good film is like a banger story that I can enjoy, and have a good time. It may be that the length, while it maybe diminishes its sort of general appeal for like easy watching, it is functioning in another way. We get actually like a long time before the fated letter even arrives, drafting him into service. So, we get this moment when he goes to a kind of first basic training, and then he's released, and they entertain the thought that maybe they won't call the farmers up. Maybe, the war will end. France has surrendered. And so we're allowed to kind of live in this tension, this unknowing.
Right.
It would be curious, actually, hearing from someone who knows nothing about Blessed Franz before seeing the film, who doesn't know where this film is going. But even if you do know where it's going, it kind of forces you to take your time. You can't just jump to, okay, take me to the heroic part. It's a long time before he finally gets called up. And then, it happens very quickly after that he's arrested. It's almost anticlimactic. But then it's a long time again before he's, brought before that tribunal and set to be executed. He's in one prison, and then he's taken to another prison, and he's there for a while, and then there's some appeals, and then final hearing, and so this is bringing us into this experience where nothing happens until it does. Do you know what I mean? It's like there's this slow, long time, and then you're being executed.
I really like the build up, as I mentioned, the sort of the sense of foreboding and the developing of the situation over time. So where I feel the length is really in the second half, where it starts to feel repetitive in terms of the arguments that are happening, the things that people are saying to him, the appeals that are being made. And there doesn't seem to be that much difference between one interrogator and the next, other than Bruno Ganz is distinctive because he's given more time as an individual character whose conscience is being challenged.
Or the dynamics that are happening at home with the wife and the flack that she's taking from the community.
For me, it starts to feel repetitive. I don't mind length per se, but it's just like, okay, there's parts where it starts to feel a little tedious.
Sure.
This is a good point about, giving you this space to enter into it, both with the length and the sort of the relative silence of Blessed Franz. I do think we should touch, not as much as we did in the original episode, but a little bit on the aspect of the church, insofar as like one of our complaints might be that Franz is reduced maybe to a little bit more of a generic Christian than a Catholic. He's definitely Christian, and you could argue that in some ways it's more, his life of prayer is more there than it is in A Man for All Seasons or something like that via voiceover, even though we don't see him at Mass or anything. But yeah, in terms of, yes, you mentioned the devotional life, the Sacred Heart, the sacraments, but there's obviously any number of reasons someone could argue for why we don't need to see him doing the First Friday devotions in this film.
Sure.
So then where you might complain a little bit more is the portrayal of the church as an institution, insofar as we get the priest not helping him and essentially telling him to give in. We get the bishop not really helping him and essentially telling him to give in.
Yeah.
You have a duty to your fatherland.
Right.
And that's not false. Those things did happen.
Yeah.
But there also was another bishop and there was another priest who supported him and gave him good counsel and brought him communion in prison and things like that.
Right.
So in that sense,
it's just not the whole picture.
It's not the whole picture, and it again leaves, I guess you could say, it highlights Franz's aloneness even more.
Yeah. But he wasn't alone, which is the truth. The truth is that he was really supported by the church, by the sacraments, and by his wife. And so that's kind of the angle that I think the film has us look to the most in terms of where his support is coming from.
Yes.
And so the last scene between the two of them, where she sort of definitively places herself in his corner, is a very, very moving scene,
right?
And a great payoff, because we see her wrestling with it through the film as well.
Very similar scene in, not to keep mentioning A Man for All Seasons, but the very, very similar scene with St. Thomas More's wife, where she's been angry at him actually, and then suddenly sort of just like surrenders to this at the very end. I agree that the support is mostly coming from his wife, and there's other moments of solidarity, hidden solidarity with other villagers and things like that. But so I mean, we don't need to hammer the point. Any Catholic listener will understand why we take issue with maybe the portrayal of the church.
Like I said, listen to that other discussion of Hidden Life. It's still a good podcast, and we get into a little more detail on this subject and others.
So this isn't story related, but something we haven't touched on is the change in collaborators that we see in Hidden Life, key collaborators. So especially cinematography and I believe production design. What really stood out to me on this viewing, visually, when I first saw it 6 years ago, I didn't think it was that big of a departure from kind of the Malick essence that we'd seen for, all the 2000s pretty much, which is another way of saying Malick's collaboration with Emmanuel Lubezki, starting with The New World, going up all the way through to the end of Song to Song. And Lubezki did not shoot this film. Instead, one of their longtime camera collaborators, Jörg Widmer, stepped up to become the full cinematographer for the film. And so there is a sense of continuity in that, Widmer operated the Steadicam, he operated the camera so much with Lubezki on those previous shoots that there is a sense of continuity of style, of this wide view of the world and the spontaneous, response to what's happening following the action with a very fluid sense. But what's interesting to me is you do see in the operation, it's not when you watch enough Lubezki operated films, when Lubezki's operating the camera himself, like you really start to see it. There's a particular sensitivity and there's a particular fluidity that is unique to Lubezki that isn't in this film. It's a bit,
I think this is a little more rough around the edges in terms of,
it's a bit more rough around the edges. Framing is bizarre. I think the film's always like really interesting to look at, but there are some strange like framing choices with kind of where characters are in relation to the light and just the foreground, background. It's a bit, I don't know how to describe it. It's a bit off.
I agree. I totally agree.
And then in a similar sense, what really also stood out to me on this one was the sense of color, I think, is quite different from everything else that we've seen in Malick. And I believe that's largely because the film was shot. It's his first like fully digitally shot film from what I understand. But it just really stood out on this viewing. Like the color palette is like a lot of films shot digitally in the last 10 years. It's just not, it tends to be a bit more monotonous, in like just the cast of the color, it's quite rich in its own way. And I notice especially whenever they're shooting interiors that are lit, by the sunlight outside. I don't know if it's an issue with like that particular camera sensor is maybe just better, more responsive to certain situations than others, but it does stand out in comparison to what I would say is like a very rich color palette of the rest of Malick's films, and I think the choice to shoot in digital is part of that. So one thing I hope for his new film, whenever we get to see that, is to see whether that develops or whether that changes in any significant way.
Is Vidmer shooting that one?
I believe he is. I'm not 100%, but I believe he is. And then just part of the color thing as well is actually in production design. This is that element of color design in films that is often completely overlooked. The production designer plays a huge role, of course, in like how the feel of just everything goes, right? Because they're designing the physical space. Jack Fisk, who worked with Malick on every film since Badlands, I'm pretty sure he wasn't on this one. I think that is another factor of like the change in collaborators. I think there are some subtle changes to just the feel of it. And, there is that continuity, but it's a bit, it's a bit different.
Yeah, I definitely noticed that relative, not quite as, perfect as Lubezki's, cinematography, even though doing the same approach more or less. The other thing I will say is that I don't think this film has as many memorable images as the last several Malick films do. I mean, this original poster behind me is probably like the most famous shot of the film. And of course, you can say it's a gorgeous film because the landscape is gorgeous, but I wouldn't say so much that the beauty of the film is so much due to, beautiful moving camera shots or scenarios or things like that are sort of unique and stick in your mind. Right. It's maybe not as poetically memorable in that sense, even though it's got the sort of the Malick aesthetic in a broad sense. I wanted to say a little bit about the music. It's got a very nice original score by James Newton Howard, along with, some of Malick's usual use of classical pieces, choral pieces and such. Going back to the idea that this is sort of the first straightforward narrative film that he's done since The New World, I also thought that this was probably the least music-driven film that he's done since The New World. It's nice, it's beautiful, but I don't think the cues are as memorable. I've seen it 3 times now as things that happened in, Tree of Life onward. So it is interesting, and it kind of makes sense to me because, again, as a plot-driven film, this film has less and less montage-driven. This film has less need of sort of these amazing music cues to kind of pull these diverse shots together as the previous few films. And so it's neither good nor bad, but it is also kind of one of these things that shifts with this new approach. The sort of the main like theme of the film is very nice. We have this recurrent motif, and it plays
very largely at the beginning of the film, and it's one of the reasons why I think the beginning of the film is so amazing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is significant. Like the theme it's the first memorable Malick original theme since The Thin Red Line.
Yeah,
you know,
that's a good point.
Right.
Where the original music is what stands out. And there is actually, it's interesting if you look at the credits, like it's interesting you have that impression, Thomas, because like there is a ton of other music in the film, but so much of it, I think, is there's a lot of Arvo Pärt in there. There's a lot of minimalist, wholly minimalist kind of type music, which he's used all throughout his career. But it's interesting how I think what's maybe different here is like so much of it is just kind of blending into the next.
It's kind of a general choral classical sound, and maybe it's part because it's Arvo Pärt, and maybe his pieces aren't as memorable. But the thing is, like you hear it and you say, oh, that's nice, but I don't think, oh, this specific piece, I remember this piece at this moment. Yeah. Like it's all over the place with Tree of Life.
Yeah.
And conversely, like the original score, like in Tree of Life, like there's lots of actual original score in Tree of Life that doesn't stand out in that way, which is it's interesting that here it really stands. It's the opposite dynamic here,
Yeah. So in this, it's a nice score, and I do like the original score. I just think it functions more conventionally, which is fine.
Yeah, I do hope that that he takes just everything further with this next film. I don't know when we'll finally get to see it. It might be many years.
It sounds like it's more vignette based. It's parable based, right? And so it could have a very different structure than this, but it also could have a different structure than the previous films as well. So,
but I do feel like if we could just dial all those notches back up to 11 and then still keep the focused application of all of these techniques on a particular subject, we could be in for something very, very special with the next film.
Well, just, overall assessment, this is a film that, wow, Terrence Malick made a film about a Catholic saint, so I should, be morally obligated to rate this the highest, but I wouldn't even say it's in my top few favorite Terrence Malick films, in part because the cinematography isn't quite on the level as the previous few, in part because it feels too long to me, and in part just on Catholic grounds that, like, okay, well, the fact that he's not emphasizing the Catholic aspect so much gives me the freedom to be like, okay, well, then I don't have to rate it as high just because it's Catholic, So yeah, to me, Tree of Life is still my favorite Malick film, and there's others that I would still rate. I would enjoy more, even though I might recommend this as a starting point for many Catholics because of its subject matter.
Maybe one thing I will just say is that I think it shines in the area of performances.
Oh yeah, we haven't really talked about that.
Yeah, so I think that
August Diehl plays Blessed Franz and Valerie Pachner plays Franziska.
And they're both amazing. And so obviously Malick gets to work with the best of the best, and he has his actors do different things. And so we get cool performances in all of his films. But I think that nothing, perhaps since Tree of Life, or maybe even before that, approaches like the caliber of performance that we get from this leading duo. I mean, it's not easy to thread the needle on some of these like really intense scenes that they have to pull off. Not just like the sincerity of their love without it coming across as like corny or unreal, but the real tension that underlies the show of support that his wife is giving to him, and also the heroic, stance that he's taking to also convey that underneath that is a real struggle. That's not easy.
Yeah.
And then, I mentioned it before, but I'll point to it again. This last scene between the two of them is like, I mean, that is not easy to pull off either. You have all of this heartache and turmoil and sadness and grief together with a moment of real reconciliation. Not that they needed to forgive each other or anything, but they did need to come together, and there's a real resolution between the two of them that's at once beautiful and joyful and profound and like devastating, so it's like, how do you do that? Well, they did it, and so I think that probably it's a function of his working from a script, his working with a little clearer of a focus. There's more there for the actors to prepare. There's also more source material for them to draw upon, because we have Blessed Franz's letters. We also have his wife's letters, and his wife's letters were in many ways equally
You didn't
heroic.
tell them to read Anna Karenina.
Well, I think that there's just a lot of like red meat there for an actor to dig into in preparation and then in execution on the day of shooting, So, I just think, especially when you think about the Weightless Trilogy, there's nothing that like approaches the level of sort of nuance and dynamism. And let's also be clear that like Malick, to say that it's not as beautiful as another Malick film is like, that's a huge qualification. Like it's still really beautiful.
Yeah.
To say the music doesn't work as memorably as another Malick film is like still okay. It's working at a really high level.
Yeah,
But I do want to just sort of say that if there is a little bit of a receding in these other elements, the performance element is really present, and it tells me that Malick still knows how to work with actors. He can work with them in this free-flowing, dancey, playful, like yada yada way. And when it comes time to get down to brass tacks, he can also shoot like a mean, farewell scene.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
and the sense of Blessed Franz feeling that pressure on him increasing, I think August Diehl does a great job conveying that.
I'd say it's the first time we see all through Malick's career, critically speaking, there's this constant kind of like temptation to divide the 1970s films from or maybe like Thin Red Line and everything before that with the New World and everything after that, the more classical against the more spontaneous or modern or experimental. And this is the film where they really all come back together. There really is like a union. The same Malick who made Days of Heaven is totally present here in a way that maybe is like a little bit more in the background in the other films. And
I feel like you see it. Sorry to just jump in, but like I see Days of Heaven in here as much as I see Tree of Life,
exactly,
which is kind of amazing.
There's a synthesis of that quest. Like it's very clear from those who worked with him on the New Worlds. Is talking about how much he was going out just seeking something. When they're filming, and that's where this improvisational kind of like approach really starts to take off. It's Come Home. I think we see it Come Home in a way that's not like a return to exclusively kind of classical, conventional dramatic forms, but it really is something. It's a new synthesis. It's really something that's all his own. And to me, that's partly that's the great artistically. That's the great joy of this film, is seeing that. It's this renewal of approaches, and I think he's going to carry that into his next one. Just one small example, like when you're talking about performance, James, it makes me think about the blocking of the film and how much of the film takes place in these constrained interior spaces. A lot of it's inside, and when we think of the last decade and a half of Malick, before this point where it's like everyone's just running around and the cliche of course is like everyone's twirling in the fields and all that, and it's like here these are everyone, how many times is he told, like he walks into a room and he's told like take a seat, the dramatic moment that you're talking about, I agree with you, like this is the finest like scene in the film, the resolution of I'm with you, Franziska to Franz, takes place in this room, and anyway, there's something there about like the poetry of Malick's poetic, Malick's way of depicting romantic love is so often about movement, about dance. Like love is a dance out in the open. And here we see
they're not even allowed to embrace each other.
Exactly. The dance is constrained. It's crucified. Like they are truly all prisoners, and there's such a beauty that comes out of that constraint.
Yeah. Well, man, I'm so glad that we talked about this movie a second time, because I really do feel like this is a level of analysis that we really weren't capable of when we first watched the film.
Right.
And just in part because we weren't coming off of having freshly watched all of the films preceding it,
but just 5 years of Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and it does make me proud that that we end talking about the performances and that we're not leading the discussion with like, Oh, it's just great acting, man. Sorry, don't mean to be salty or anything. But like, there's a lot more to talk about.
Right.
Can I ask one question? I know we're probably close to
Sure.
wrapping, but I did want to ask you guys, do you think this film changes the map of the Saint film as a genre? Like, do you feel like it adds anything new? Is it give us hope? Like, what's your take on what this brings to that kind of particular genre?
Okay, well, you're going to hate my answer because the first thing I'm going to point to is that scene with the painter, because I think that's the most obvious contribution that it makes to the discussion is like, okay, let's talk about like what it takes to depict a saint.
Right.
But yeah, if I step away from that and think about it more,
People have clearly seen it. They've clearly been inspired by it. I think Terrence Malick's influence is in Triumph of the Heart, which we all just watched.
yes,
I think even certain lines or beats are perhaps inspired by A Hidden Life. I wouldn't be surprised if you asked the person who made the best recent Saint film if he was inspired by this and Malick in general.
Yes.
I'd like to have him back on to discuss some other film and see who his influences are. But
right.
But I don't know. I have to imagine from the discourse, I can't point to any film, not that I've seen that many new Saint films since then, but like I can't point to any one that seems particularly Malick influenced other than Triumph of the Heart. But I have to imagine that it's percolating in there because people have been talking about it so much for the past 5 years. People haven't stopped talking about this. I don't hear people talking about Cabrini anymore, but people are still talking about Hidden Life and talking about how great this film is. So I think this film really did influence the Catholic film discourse, if only by just bringing Malick into the Catholic film discourse, which is like a pretty big thing to drop in there,
Right.
you know?
Right. Right. Yeah. And I also think that maybe this just relates more to the figure of Blessed Franz than it does to the film itself. But I think that it's important that here is a married man, a layman, and that we get so much of a sense of the importance of the marriage in motivating, fueling, supporting this kind of sanctity. In less capable hands that easily could have kind of been fallen by the wayside. But Malick does a very good job of illustrating just how central of a driving force that was. But formally, I don't know. The Saint film as a genre in itself. I mean, obviously, I think that Malick has contributed formally in a lot of ways, just across the board, and that I believe that those can, of course, be applied to the project of making a Saint film. Yeah, I really think it just comes in the form of this kind of challenge from the painter. Like, well, gosh, how do we do this? How do we do this absent our own skin in the game? Is maybe that is the central thing,
Right?
Because that is what we heard from Anthony D'Ambrosio, the director of Triumph of the Heart, when we interviewed him. People should check out that interview as well. It was awesome.
Mm-hmm.
But it really kind of did come down to like, you got to have some skin in the game.
Yeah, I think it's somewhat too early to say as well. You don't drop Hidden Life and then Catholic filmmakers suddenly learn how to use a camera, in a way that's not just sort of boilerplate. So
what do you think, Nathan?
No, I mean, I largely agree with you guys. I think Triumph of the Heart, which I just watched, is a we could say a first fruit in some sense. Not that the film exists because of A Hidden Life, but I think you can definitely see the influence of Malick in it, especially in and I believe Anthony and his cinematographer have spoken about this in other interviews, cool. At least in passing. But
yeah, I mean, it's clear to see it.
You
really
especially see it, there. And what most impressed me about the film, just as I'm still sitting with it, formally was the way that they turned a single space, a single room into something that was, I can't think of a single time when I thought, oh, they've covered this frame, or they're running out of ideas for how to shoot this space. Like I think one of the film's great achievements directorially is how they make that space constantly compelling.
Yeah.
And I think that only comes from a fluid sense of looking at a space and looking and blocking and just a fluidity of approach that is patently Malickian. Like when Malick someday sadly will depart from this earth, I think that will be his lasting legacy, is showing us how to be flexible and how to approach the real world with a camera in a way that is just kind of endlessly organic and fecund. And you see that that principle is just totally magnified in Triumph of the Heart. I think they take that and they run with it in a way that's unique to their film, so I'm hoping I hope more filmmakers will pick up on that, explicitly or implicitly, whatever it takes to kind of break us out of the conventional molds that we still see, in other depictions.
Well, that was a great question, and a great point about Triumph of the Heart using space in that way. And it's a good place to stop because, of the directors that we've covered. Well, I guess Malick is the first director whose entire filmography we've covered. This is, I don't know that we're going to discuss another one who is as sort of directly relevant to Catholic filmmakers today.
Yeah.
And so given that we're ending the line here, that it's good to look to the future. And that's why we do, again, we've said a million times, that's why we do this podcast, is to get people to look at these films. And if they've already watched them, to look at more aspects of them and more things that are not always on the front of the minds of Catholic audiences, let's say. So,
and I think as much as we need Catholic filmmakers and artists, or in Malick's case, non-Catholic filmmakers and artists out there making good art, we also need critics who are capable of kind of unpacking that and discussing it and bringing to light some of what we've talked about today, And so while I don't necessarily consider myself a film critic, I guess functionally that's how we operate here. Point, but we want to talk about these and we want to elevate the conversation and really, all of us want to be watching movies better. And so, I guess if I can just sort of like cravenly make a plug for supporting us, because we're in the middle of a big fundraising campaign. So if you've reached it to the end of this episode and you agree with us that this caliber of conversation and analysis is a valuable thing, as we think it is, not just for listeners like you, but for Catholic artists and artists of all, stripes, then please support us. We can't do this very niche podcast and work without your generous support. So you can go to catholicculture.org/donate. And we would be just so grateful for anything you could throw our way.
Great. Well, Nathan, thanks for going on the Malick journey with us. It's not over. I have to hope that,
we still have to do a shot on Google Pixel 3, I think, the ad he made for the Google phone.
Oh my gosh, that would be such a fun bonus episode.
There's also a perfume ad that he did.
I would love to do some Malick commercials.
Yeah, we haven't done the commercials. So
dude, we definitely need to do it as a bonus episode.
We can do like a short bonus episode on his commercials, yeah.
Yeah.
And Werner Herzog's documentary about the Killers. Thank
you guys. I really appreciate your just having me on for the series. It's been a total joy, total pleasure to dive in, go deep. Never had a chance to do anything like this. So thank you. It's been a joy.
We couldn't have done it at this level without you, Nathan, and it was very rewarding. And I'm sure we'll do it with other directors in the future. We've certainly got some other people that we've talked about doing.
Other people.
Other people.
Well, we just don't want to commit ourselves.
No, other directors. I mean,
yeah, that's what I mean too.
Yes. If we don't do their full filmographies, we'll do more.
Yeah, for sure.
Rossellini, Ford, etc. So thanks everybody for listening. Actually, you know what? In the comments on our YouTube channel, rank your Terrence Malick rankings. Rank your rankings. And if you don't rank them well, we'll give you a spanking. So, yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Good stuff.
Do you want to take that again? Or?
Sure. All right, everybody. Thanks for following us on this, Lebanese Texan journey that is Terrence Malick. And isn't that correct? Isn't he like Lebanese and Texan?
Oh, we just don't want to say goodbye.
I don't want to say goodbye. It is hard to say goodbye. You know, we don't know when our next meal, our next Malick meal is coming from.
Yeah. How about this?
I'll see you in the mountains.
Yeah, okay, so just before we leave, just before we sign off from this Malick series, one last time, how about we do a quick ranking? Top 3, maybe.
Oh, gosh.
Top 3 favorite Malicks. And don't overthink it. You know, go with your gut.
Tree of Life, The New Worlds, A Hidden Life for me.
Wow. That's a respectable list. Tree of Life, The New World, A Hidden Life.
I think for me it's backwards from Tree of Life, New World, and Thin Red Line. Backwards chronologically.
I think I have to put Tree of Life top dog.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay.
I just think that like it's the most perfect film of all of them. I put To the Wonder a close second just because it's still for me the most beloved, but Tree of Life is I think the most perfect. And then, man, I don't know what I want to do with this third one. It's definitely not The New World. The New World for me is like it's like way back on the list. I
Don't overthink it,
want
James.
to give it to another Weightless film.
Don't overthink it.
Yeah, I want to give it to Knight of Cups. So I think it's going to be Tree of Life, To the Wonder, Knight of Cups. Yeah.
You know what? I have to say Knight of Cups would be in my third spot on any given day. So
Oh yeah.
Really?
I can't choose, but yeah, I respect that.
Yeah. And I feel bad that all of my top 3 are in this particular period of Malick's, but that's where I came in. That's where I fell in love. And for me, that's where the heat still is.
I mean, you have to consider who you're talking to, right?
That's the
Weightless
thing.
Trilogy. You have to be like, is this going to scandalize this person?
Yeah, that's right.
I used to say To the Wonder. I would have said To the Wonder. Before doing the series, I think To the Wonder, I would have been way more cavalier on. Like, yeah, it's like, there's a lot there. But certainly I would not make that a first recommendation.
But I will say that if I were to do a full ranking, Voyage of Time, I think would go up a lot higher than maybe people would expect.
I literally forgot about that when we were just doing this ranking.
I really like that film. I like it a lot.
Yeah, that's
It might even be in my top 5.
I would put that at the top ranking of Malick's commercials. It's like a commercial for Earth. A commercial for God's green Earth.
Commercial for Earth. Next time we send like a satellite out into deep space with like artifacts from Earth, we should include that movie.
This is what it was like, baby. You missed it. You missed it when the party was really going.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I can't think of any more polls to take, and who knows if all of those polls will even be included in the final cut. But or maybe I could easily rearrange your guys' picks however I want. I could like switch your worst to your top.
You could just pull a Terrence Malick on us. Dude, yeah. What would be really Malickian is if we just cut Nathan out of the interview entirely.
Yes. Just or not cut out completely, but just have him come in for like 30 seconds or something,
right.
And then it's like
I'm all of a sudden just like a secondary character.
And it's like half a sentence, and it's like you just hear like fragments of sentences just sort of like floating through.
It's like a memory of a podcast episode that we could have recorded. Well, this is it, boys. Goodbye, Terrence Malick. Maybe once we hit stop recording, we can console ourselves by just saying who we want to cover next, the next director, who we think we should. Because we should definitely do this again.
Yeah.
And like not too long from now.
Yeah.
But
okay, thanks, listeners. Bye.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.